for joining me for another episode of Redeeming Truth. I'm John, one of the pastors here, and I'm here again with John Stonestreet. He is the president of the Colson Center. And if you've watched our other videos, you know that I'm bringing him on our podcast because he is an expert when it comes to the Christian worldview and how it impacts culture, how it should impact culture. And so, John, thank you for being here again. My goal for this episode is to talk through the connection between Christianity and the Christian worldview, Judeo-Christian worldview, and America, and the idea of America that became the United States. And so I just saying that, would go ahead and tee off on that.
Well, I mean, the question is America a Christian nation? And the place we have to begin is in Scripture. And Scripture doesn't use Christian to describe any nation. Scripture doesn't talk about one nation being chosen over another, except for the nation of Israel. And then because of the nation of Israel, God blesses all the other nations of the earth and calls for himself what, Peter actually uses in his epistle, this language to describe the church as kind of a set apart people, kind of the next version of the chosen people. So what people, I think, tend to mean when they say Christian nation is some sort of kind of exclusive arrangement with God like Israel had or something like that. And I don't find any biblical support for that whatsoever. However, the other question is, well, is it the sort of nation that aligns with what we know to be true from Scripture or not? In other words, all nations are built upon histories. Some of those histories are grounded in ideals. We can certainly see this is true with Islamic nations, particularly those that go into the more fundamentalist or extreme direction, where they literally see the application of Sharia law as the basis for their law. That's not how we see all laws in America. There's no laws about speed limits or, state boundaries or electoral college versus popular votes or anything like that. But we do believe that the Bible gives us a philosophy of life, what we would call a worldview. And the laws that we have would either align to that view or not align to that view. I'll give you a real hard example. So in our founding documents, we have this phrase: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That was an ideal that was put into the Declaration of Independence that our nation clearly violated until all the way through the Civil War, probably led in some sense to the Civil War, that you had this ideal and then this reality. You had this constitutional language about how much of a citizen an African slave was, or, things like that. I mean, in other words, it was an ideal that we didn't live up to, but it put our nation on a trajectory. Now, the question is that ideal aligned with the biblical ideal or not? And so when we talk about the Christian roots of America, or we're really talking about alignment with biblical ideals, biblical principles, the biblical understanding of right and wrong, the biblical understanding of the created order, right? And especially, and I think this is really where you see things become practical, is whether the American whether American law, American government, American society best reflects the biblical understanding of who we are as human beings, right? Are we evolved animals with instincts and appetites, or are we inherently valuable, made in the image of God? And then how do our laws align with all of that? So we're really not talking about some sort of special status arrangement with God. We're just talking about, it's kind of to quote Abraham Lincoln. The question isn't, is God on our side? The question is are we on God's side? And I think that's really the question we're getting at here.
So when it comes to the idea of freedom itself, is there a biblical Christian worldview ideal that then led to the ideal of freedom that we have in our country?
Yeah, it's freedom with limits, and it's not just random limits, not arbitrary limits, not limits imposed just because the king had a whim one day and what he says goes, right? I mean, that's the way a lot of nations, a lot of civilizations and cultures were run in human history. No, the biblical idea of freedom is because of who we are, right? I use this illustration. Like, imagine that I was a pilot and I went down to the airport and I hop in my plane and I'm like, I'm feeling quite free today and I don't feel like flying my plane. I'm going to drive it. So I get to the end of the runway and I turn left and I'm running over Hummers. It's kind of fun, And then I think I'm going to go see Pikes Peak. And so I start climbing up, the mountain. It's not going to work. I'm going to be constrained by my freedom, right? If I want to see Pikes Peak in my plane, I shouldn't drive it. I should fly it. Why? Because that's what the plane was designed for. And see, all of this goes back to this question: are humans designed for something, or are humans randomly chance accidents of the universe, right? So this is where we go back to the language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator. Look, if you are designed, you're most free, not when you do whatever you want. You will be most free when you are who God created you to be. So let's take the understanding of freedom that drove the American experiment versus the understanding of freedom that drove the French Revolution. Now, if you really want to get deep on this, we recently had an online event and Os Guinness talked about this. And I don't know if we can point people that direction, John, but Oz had a wonderful talk on comparing those two, because the understanding of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And by the way, that word happiness was an ordered happiness in the founders' minds. It wasn't just giddiness or giggliness or just whatever I like that brings me pleasure. It was this understanding of the good life. And that's a very, very different understanding than the French Revolution, which was basically not a freedom for virtue or a freedom for the good life as the Americans thought of it. And then, by the way, when I say the Americans, I don't mean like every single American got this right. Jefferson, fiddled with the French ideas probably way too much, but the rest of the founders had a very interesting kind of ordered sense of liberty. Whereas the French idea was a freedom from, you remember one of the thinkers that influenced the French Revolution. I don't know if you want to get into this much history, but he once said that man will not be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. Now, that's a pretty graphic thing here for your podcast, but do you understand what he was saying? He was saying, look, freedom comes when we're freed from restraint, when we can free ourselves from that religion, and we can free ourselves from the tyranny of religion and the tyranny of the state. That's what real freedom is. That's a very different understanding of the American founders, who thought that our freedom was a gift of God and allowed us to operate freely in our relationship with God, and then build towards something that we would call the good life, that would be a blessing to us and a blessing to others. So
it's
very
freedom
different.
to govern myself versus freedom or the lack of freedom, therefore being governed by somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, and it is, but it's also that key thing. It's the game of prepositions: freedom from or freedom for. If we think freedom is just getting rid of all consequences, all accountability, all responsibility, and even, I mean, listen, we're having a conversation in America right now where we want to be free from biology.
Right.
But biology is like gravity, right? The universe is built a particular way. So we can think we can free ourselves from our DNA, but you can't. You can't step off the roof and then choose not to hit the ground. So you can see how the American understanding of ordered liberty was one that is based on a framework that the universe has a design, that humans have a purpose, and so on.
And so this plays itself out in the economic structure that we have in America, right?
Yeah, look, the question of economics comes down to this: are humans the problem, or are humans also the solution, right? Now, we all know that there's a problem with communities, but to see there's this this belief, and this would fall into the category of what we would call socialism, that all the resources in the world is a fixed pie, right? And this is how big it is. And you got to put eaters there, essentially humans. And the biggest problem with this would be either that one eater eats more than his fair share, or that there's too many eaters, right? So we see this mentality play itself out where we have a disdain for the rich getting richer. We think that if ever the rich get richer, the poor necessarily get poorer. And that hasn't been the case. Or we think that, we're always, on the verge of catastrophe because of overpopulation. The other view is to see, yes, the world is a world of resources, but the pie that is this big, when you add in humans, not just as eaters, but you add in their ingenuity, their innovation, their imagination, suddenly you see resources get bigger, right? So here's an iPhone. Started out as a grain of sand, in other words, that's unbelievable. And so many of the predictions, by the way, back in the 70s, you might have heard of a book called The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich. I mean, he predicted that we would be going through mass starvation right now, that the world would run out of resources because of the population growth. Well, the population exceeded his predictions. And not only are we not running out of food, we're producing more food on a global basis than ever before in human history, and more than is needed. Our problem isn't, by the way, production, it's distribution. But we've seen, short of pandemics and famines and things like that, which we're now better able to deal with, that the global abject poverty rate has been cut in more than half in just the last 30 years. So in other words, it's a very different vision, but it's not just a different vision of outcomes, and it's not just a different vision of structure. John, it's a different vision of who we are. Are we eaters, or are we made in the image of God, able to be co-creators with him in all the language that the Bible uses?
So this really is a battle of worldviews at the end of the day when it comes to our voting, it's right now we can see the battle between the ideals of the American Revolution and the French Revolution being played out in our culture right now. We could talk all day about these things. I just hope that stimulated people enough. Two things. One, how do people find that Oz Guinness event online if they're interested?
Yeah, I mean, you could, we had a conference called Truth, Love, Together. It was a 5-module, 20 speakers. We did it during the middle of the lockdowns of the, COVID-19. And it's, and you can find it there. Just go to conference.colsoncenter.org, conference.colsoncenter.org. And I'll send you the link offline here, John, so you can, share it around. But it's a wonderful talk, and it just kind of goes to the heart of a lot of these issues.
That'll be great. And then finally, if people want to know more about your ministry in particular, how do people get connected to you?
Breakpoint.org is our website. Again, breakpoint.org. And by the way, from there, you can also find the Truth, Love, Together event and Oz Guinness's talk. Or if you're a podcast listener, just look up the Breakpoint podcast, wherever you get your podcast. You can also, of course, when you go to our website, sign up and we'll deliver you our daily commentary on something happening in the culture from a Christian worldview perspective through email. And you just sign up there on the sign up button right there on the homepage.
Well, I know all of our staff are signed up. We get your emails every day, and so very grateful for your ministry personally, as well as our staff is. Well, thank you for being on with us, John. And if you're watching, thank you for watching this. I hope you've stayed to the very end, because there are some very critical points made there about the different visions of the world, and yet how the Christian vision of the world, the Judeo-Christian biblical worldview, created a lot of the things that we take for granted now as Americans, but that are slowly being eroded. And so you, Christian, you need to know that, so that you can see what it is that you actually have, and not only appreciate God for that, but also see what you can do to love your neighbor, to see how to strengthen those things with your life. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for Redeeming Truth.